Anders, it's great to see you today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Anders, you're a defense analyst at the Royal Danish Defense College. So you deal with Russia every day and you follow it very carefully. What do you make of the recent decision by the International Criminal Court to put out arrest warrants for senior Russian leaders, such as Gerasimov and Shoigu?
Yeah, I think it's actually received way too little attention in the media. It's been kind of overshadowed by other big things, and I think people have maybe also just gotten used to these discussions about Russian war crimes and things like that. But really, it is a big deal that we now have um, the former defense minister and the current chief of the general staff of Russia being charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity at an international court. They can't travel anymore. And I think it's worth reflecting on. And I think it's also a case that really is important for understanding what is at stake in this war, and that it is actually a lot bigger than just cases against these individuals. There is something systemic going on here. So it's also just a possibility of looking into the whole question of war crimes and what is it actually that's going on here, and that there's a whole kind of clash of values happening here. So I think it's an important case.
So why do you think it is so important that these arrest warrants that came out from the ICC? What does that mean about what's going on with Russia? And what does it mean in the larger context of the war?
Well, it really shows how there are different worldviews at play here, and how this is a battle that is not just about what's going on in Ukraine or about holding people accountable, but that it is actually it's a battle between a worldview where we have the sort of rules-based international world order, where we have the ICC, there are rules of what can states do, and then on the other side we have this worldview that might makes right, and you have the great powers and they're above the law. And I think it's important to understand that Russia is being very deliberate here, that there is actually a strategic purpose with the war crimes. It's not just that it's something that happens because they have bad discipline or a culture of violence or something like that. It's actually something they do on purpose because they want to challenge the idea of a rules-based world order. And so they want, from a Russian perspective, they're actually quite happy to have these cases against high-ranking officials. And of course, they're not going to send anyone to the Hague. So the point is to demonstrate that this court is useless, that it doesn't work, and to humiliate the ICC, and through that to challenge the idea of a rules-based world order. So my point is just that there is a lot at play here, and it really shows that how deep the value conflict is also between the Western worldview and the Russian worldview, and ultimately that the war is about so much more than just territory in eastern Ukraine, that it's really about something bigger, and it's about the future world order that we want to live in.
So if Russia doesn't even respect their national order when it comes to things like war crimes or crimes against humanity, how is it going to be possible to create a lasting peace? A lot of people now are saying that Ukraine and Russia should just sort of strike a deal. How realistic do you think that is?
I think it's a problem when the conflict is being reduced to being a question about just territory. I mean, this war was from the beginning not about territory in eastern Ukraine. It was about a lot more than that. It was about all of Ukraine. It was about the future security structures of Europe. It was about redefining the world order. And I still think that is the case from a Russian point of view. And in the West, too many people don't understand that. And we have a tendency to assume that, well, if they can just agree on where the border should be in eastern Ukraine, then we can have peace. And that is absolutely not the case. Russia's goals with the war are much bigger. They still have the ambitions of redefining the world order, to really move toward a system where it is the great powers that make the rules, and then the smaller states sort of have to orient themselves against whatever rules the great powers make. And so I think it's just really important that we keep that in mind, and that also means that we are actually quite far, I think, from having any kind of lasting peace agreement. And it is a problem when we have these ideas coming out in the West there was just this peace plan coming out this last week about what Donald Trump might do if he's elected and what his peace plan might look like. It's very naive that you have these ideas that you can just strike a deal about where the border should be, and then that's fine, because that's absolutely not going to end the war.
So, looking ahead, what do you think the long-term perspectives are for the war? The Russians have said a lot. They have a much bigger country, a lot more people, so they have the ability to keep waging war. Don't you think that they haven't reached their peak yet? And how about the Ukrainian side?
Well, we should not overestimate the Russian ability to wage the war. I mean, it's a large country, but Ukraine is also a large country. And I think if we look at the long-term perspective, then actually, if the Western support remains high, then I would say the time is on Ukraine's side. The Russian sort of capability in production, in military might, in their ability to use old stocks of Soviet weapons, all those things, it's really at a peak at this moment, and it's going to decline over the coming years. All kinds of problems for the Russian economy that they're going to run into if the war continues. Whereas the Ukrainian capability is still sort of rising. We have the Western countries still increasing the defense production. So if we have continued strong support for Ukraine, then I actually see time being on Ukraine's side. I know it's not a pleasant thought if you are in Ukraine and you really want this war to end, but I think from a purely military point of view, it's actually in Ukraine's interest to drag the war out and to make it last longer. But of course, it depends on continued Western support.
So, what's a realistic outcome look like if this goes forward? Or what would it look like? What would Russia wish to achieve, and what would Ukraine wish to achieve? What do you think is a realistic outcome for both of them at this point?
I think the Russian goal with the war is ultimately still the same as it's been all along. It's total control over all of Ukraine. It's basically to turn Ukraine into a kind of Belarus version 2. And that means that it's about regime change in Ukraine. It's about getting total control over all of Ukraine. It's not just about some regions in eastern Ukraine. If we have a kind of peace deal that some people imagine where, okay, Russia gets to keep some of the territory in eastern Ukraine, and then the rest of Ukraine can be free and join the Western alliance and all those things, then in Russia, that would be seen as them losing the war. So that's not an acceptable outcome for them. But of course, for Ukraine, I think the ultimate goal is to teach Russia a lesson, and once and for all, bring them to a point where it becomes clear that they are not the great power that they thought they were, and that they have to stop invading their neighbors forever, so that this will be the war that sort of ends all future wars.
Let me ask you two last questions. One, why do you think that Russia right now is talking so much about wanting to begin negotiations? What's behind that?
Well, it's clear that both sides understand that there is a pressure from especially the Western countries, but from the world community about trying to find a way to end this war. I think both sides are very keen on being seen as the side that is reasonable, that wants peace, and that the other side gets the blame for the war continuing. And I think the Russians would actually be probably fine with some kind of negotiations going on, but I don't think they would be fine about these negotiations leading to anything. So I think that's really the essential question that leaders in the West need to ask themselves. It's not how do we begin negotiations. It's about how do we actually motivate Russia to make the kinds of concessions that are necessary for reasonable compromises and to motivate them to actually end the war.
So, talking about the motivations a country might have, a lot of people see the Putin regime and believe it's, of course, highly stable. I mean, it looks like it's very rigid. How stable do you think the Putin regime is? Is it really as good as it looks, or is it a house of cards? What do you think is really going on in Moscow?
Well, it's somewhere in between, but it's definitely not as stable as it looks. It's just been a year since we had Prigozhin's mutiny and the Wagner drive on Moscow, right? And that came as a surprise, and the same thing can happen again. And So I think the Russian system is definitely shaky, and I also think it's important to understand that the way that Putin is running the government, it's basically not sustainable in the long run. So I think eventually this kind of system, it is going to end in some kind of collapse. And maybe the same way we saw the Soviet Union collapsing, it's just an unsustainable way of running a country. And I think actually one of the big questions right now is what will end first? Will it be the Putin regime or will it be the war in Ukraine? Because I think it could be either, but I think the war in Ukraine has definitely sped up that process whereby the Russian regime is going to come to an end at some point.
And I really appreciate your time. This is a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.